My name is Maria Baklanova, and I'm a Korean language lecturer at School of Asian Studies, High School of Economics, and I will be the host for today. And it's my great pleasure to introduce you Dr. Lucian Brown from Monash University, Melbourne, Australia, who is also Associate Editor of Journal of Pragmatics. And that makes it especially pleasing that we have such a turnout today. Now we have more than 60 listeners. So I think it's great. And I see my dear colleagues from High School of Economics, Elena Khokhlova, Vera Vishnikova, and Janna Son, and also my colleagues from other Russian universities that have Korean Studies Department, like Inna Tsoi from St. Petersburg State University, Elena Kondratьева from High School of Economics and Moscow State University. And I hope also my other colleagues will join us maybe like in a few minutes later. And I'm very glad to see here our students who I'm sure are eager to know more about Korean politeness and Korean polite speech. Our topic for today is honorifics and politeness in Korean, contextual and multimodal perspectives. During this lecture, we are going to talk about polite speech and politeness in Korean language, not from grammar perspective, as we used to do it when learning or teaching Korean language as foreign language, but today's talk presents multimodal perspectives, dimensions of politeness, which means gestures, visual mode, spatial mode, and some other aspects. As few comments about our lecture today. So we have from 40 to 50 minutes for lecture, and then we have about 30 minutes for questions and answers. I ask you to write down your questions in the Zoom chat box, so Dr. Brown after lecture could answer them. And I ask you also to mute your phone, mute your microphones during the lecture. Yeah. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Dr. Lucian Brown. Yeah. Doctor,
thank you.
Please. Yeah.
Can I bring up my slides now?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so thank you very much to Dr. Baklanova for the invitation. And it's really nice to be in Moscow virtually at this time when in Australia we cannot travel at all. And also I've been to Moscow several times and spent some time in Russia, so it's kind of nice to be back in a way. I'm going to be talking about my area of research, which is in honorifics and politeness in Korean. As was just mentioned, I'm going to be talking for about 40 to 45 minutes and then I'm taking questions. But if there's anything unclear during the talk, please feel free to ask me or send me a message in the chat as well. I'm going to be structuring my talk around 4 key ideas. The first one is simply that Korean has a highly developed system of honorifics. So I'm just going to begin by defining what we are talking about. I'm then going to look at the second idea, which is that honorifics are not used uniformly. So there's actually a lot of variation in how Korean speakers use honorifics. The third idea that I'll consider is that honorifics are not always polite. And then I'll get to the multimodal part and talk about how politeness in Korean goes beyond honorifics and also has phonetic, acoustic, and gestural and multimodal facets as well. And later on, when I get to those parts of my talk, I'm going to be using some examples both from Korean television, which is quite an interesting source of material, and also from recordings made in a laboratory setting. So beginning with the idea that Korean has a highly developed system of honorifics, let's just start by defining what we mean by honorifics. As with most linguistic terms, it can be a little bit difficult to pin down. But basically speaking, most definitions of honorifics talk about these as linguistic forms that mark social relationships, particularly linguistic forms that mark vertical social relationships. So the word honor itself means that you're honoring someone who is of a higher social standing than you. But honorifics obviously also do more than that. They also can mark your intimacy on the horizontal plane with the listener as well. And particularly the term honorifics is used for languages that have grammatical systems of politeness. So particularly Korean and Japanese in this regard. But we could ask the question, do all languages have honorifics? I think, again, the answer to this question is going to depend on how you define what honorifics are, but we can definitely see similar things or vaguely similar things in probably every language, even in English, where we tend to think that there's not much vertical marking of social relationships. You know, someone could address me as sir or Lucian, or in Australia, mate is a very kind of intimate or informal term of address. And you can also refer to a third person, another person, as that gentleman, that man, or that dude, depending on maybe who you're talking to or the formality of the situation. And of course, in Russian, you have different pronouns, the tu and vous pronouns as well. And this is found in a lot of European languages, French, tu, vous. English in the past had you and thou, but now only you. So you know, this is definitely a related phenomenon, but these pronoun distinctions in European languages seem to have more to do with horizontal relationships and familiarity rather than necessarily vertical relationships. But in Korean and also in Japanese, what we find is a bit more complex than that. And what makes things complex is that it's part of the grammar of the language. So pretty much in every single sentence that you utter in Korean or Japanese, you're forced into some kind of choice about which level of honorification you want to use. And this depends on your relationship with the hearer and also your relationship with the sentence referent, and also in some cases the relationship between different people that you are talking about. So Korean has hearer honorifics, honorific forms for the hearer, referent honorifics, honorific forms for the people in the sentence, and also terms of address, which can be used for either. So for hearer honorifics in Korean, Korean has numerous speech style endings. For the students here learning Korean, probably in Korean language classes, you learn polite or formal style mostly. So like the sentence, it's raining. In English, you can say it's raining in any situation, but in Korean, if you're talking to a non-intimate or a superior, you'd say 비와요 or 비옵니다. But if you're talking to an intimate or maybe a subordinate, you could say 비온다 or 비와. Then for referent honorifics, the main device that Korean uses for this is the subject honorific marker 시. The underlying principle for using this is that if you're referring to a person who is of superior social status, you include it. So 선생님이 오셨어요. Oh, and that compares with 선생이 왔어요 without the honorific. And the person who you are honoring might be the same person as the hearer, or it might be a third party. someone asked me about the kind of grammatical parts of honorifics, and one of the big controversies regarding the grammatical treatment of honorifics is whether this she works as a system of agreement. What agreement means is that when you have a certain type of subject, you have to use a certain type of verb ending. So like in English, you say, I go, but he goes. This agrees with whether you're talking about I or he. And some people have said that in Korean, it works the same way with honorifics. If you have an honorific noun, so like 선생님, then you need to have the honorifics on the verb as well. But studies that have actually used authentic data have shown that this theory is problematic. This study that I'm citing here used corpus data, and they found actually that less than 50% of sentences featuring a status superior as the subject noun included she. And if you want to kind of prove these results for yourself, one messy way to do it is to go onto Google. And if you Google 선생님이 what, you'll find that you get more hits for that than you do for 선생님이 오셨, so with the honorific. Also, this she quite often appears, particularly these days, in instances where the grammatical subject is not the target of respect. So you might have seen this on my first slide, 물은 selfseo. So 물, the water is self-service. So the subject here appears to be water, but of course it's trying to pay respect to the customer. Some people would say this kind of sentence is grammatically incorrect. Another example, this happens a lot in the service industry in Korea. So if you order a coffee, when your coffee is ready, they might say 커피 나오셨습니다, which literally seems to pay respect to the coffee, but the intention is to pay respect to the hearer. But again, if we think of she as being some kind of system of agreement, then this kind of sentence becomes quite problematic. She and these different speech styles interact with each other. So as I said, the she might refer to the second person, or it might refer to the third person as well. So maybe a test here for students learning Korean. If you're asking your teacher where they are going, so the person you're talking about is the same person who you're talking to, you would say 어디 가세요, right? Then how about if you're talking to your friend about your friends, you're asking your friend where they're going, what would you say?
I think one of our students.
어디 가, okay. Someone shouted it out, thank you, 어디 가. How about then if you're talking to your teacher, but you're talking about your friend, so you're like, where's that friend going? Like 그 친구가 어디
가요?
Yeah, okay, 가요. Right, so you have the addressee honorific, but no subject honorific. And how about then if you're talking to your friend and you're saying, where is the teacher going? 선생님이 or 선생님께서 어디
가쇼.
Yeah, so 가셔 would be the correct answer. Although maybe if you're talking to your friend in a very informal situation about a teacher who you don't like very much, then you might just say 어디 가. Right, so there is some flexibility there as well. And in complex situations, you might have to consider your relationship, not just with the subject of the sentence, but also the object of the sentence, and also think about the relationship between the subject and the object. So in this sentence here, mother, father told grandmother, you have to think of the relationship that you have with your mother, and you can make that honorific by adding 어머님 and 씁니다 on the verb. But then you also need to think about your relationship with your father. So you pay respect to your father by adding 아버님께서 and then she on the verb. And then the object honorifics are paying respect to 할머니, 할머니께 말씀을 드리다. Yeah, luckily not every sentence is as complicated as that. The second idea that I want to discuss is the idea that honorifics are not used uniformly. And I think this is somewhere where my perspective as someone who does pragmatics and social linguistics is going to be a bit different to what you find in most Korean teaching materials. Because if you've learned Korean as a second language, you'll see that most descriptions of honorifics in textbooks tend to teach honorifics in a very rule-based way, right? So you follow the rules. If you're talking about someone younger, so like 동생, it's 나이, but if you're talking about 할아버지, then it's 연세. You can say 선생님 안녕하세요, but you cannot say 선생님 안녕. So it's taught as this kind of rule-based system. But in practice, things are a lot messier than this. And you could even think of contexts where 선생님 안녕 is actually possible, right? If the 선생님 is not my actual teacher, but maybe my friend who happens to be a teacher, this kind of sentence can be pragmatically plausible. So I want to mention a study which I've worked on recently with Ji-Eun Lee, where we looked at addressee honorifics in conversations between vendors and customers. And we collected this data in quite an interesting way. We collected it from reality TV shows. So these are unscripted interactions where sometimes normal people and sometimes celebrities go to kind of traditional markets and interact with the vendors there. So I'll just show you a couple of examples from this, and we'll see that the honorifics usage in this setting is very varied. So the first thing that we did was just to count up all of the different addressee honorifics that we got. So how many 씁니다, how many 요, and how many 반말, how many non-honorific endings did we get? And you might expect that when people are interacting in a service situation, that everyone would use honorific language. Everyone would use 존댓말. And that might be the norm if you go to the department store, but in these kind of traditional markets, that's not necessarily the norm. Things are much more fluid. So we looked at, first of all, the age relationship between the customers and the vendors, and then we analyzed what level of speech the vendors and customers used. And basically, we found that it only partially corresponds to the age relationship that they had. So when the customer is older than the vendor, they would use like 44% 요 and 8% 씁니다. And as you see, it's less when the customer is younger than the vendor. So that kind of makes sense. And the 반말 is going the other way. So there's more 반말 when the customer is younger than the vendor. So 반말 being non-honorific speech. And then if we look at the customer's language, it's going the opposite direction. So they're using more 요 when they're addressing a vendor who is older than them. And then if we look at the use of 반말, it goes in the opposite direction. But you can see here there's a lot of variation as well. And also there's a lot of 반말, a lot of non-honorific language all over the place. So different to what we might expect to happen in interactions between people who don't know each other. I'll just show you a couple of examples.
아니, 어떤 거 사시던데? 요거는 얼마고? 10만 원, 12마리. 우리가 12마리짜리 없구나. 0.3개고. 얼마 돼요? 이거 비싸다 감독만 내가 어떤 거 사가지고 없으실 건데? 어떤 거 사가지고 없으실 건데?
So in this interaction, this just shows basically that you're getting a lot of 반말 everywhere. The customer's starting off with non-honorific language and the vendor is replying with non-honorific language. And the way that we analyzed this was during these kind of price negotiations that happen in a market situation, people are using 반말 as a way of gaining authority, or also emphasizing intimacy as a kind of strategy to get a bargain. And the vendors reciprocate 반말, otherwise they'll be at a disadvantage in these kind of negotiations. Another interesting thing you might have noticed was that my script here shows no 존댓말, except you do have 잡수시다 in the final sentence. It's kind of a mixture of honorific and non-honorific. But in the telopes, the the captions, they tend to correct the use of non-honorific language sometimes. So this kind of shows that it's going against the norm.
여타고요. 사탕은?
사탕 한 보건이에 3,000원씩. 6,000원어치 하셨네.
10,000원 채워서.
네. 그럼 사탕 더 드릴까?
사탕 말고 이거 한 봉다리. 이래서 10,000원. 인재의 인심.
오케이. 아유, 그럼 깎고 그러고.
또 그렇게 시장에 올장 깎는 맛도 있고 그러는 거지. 네, 복 더 많이 받으시고요. 돈 많이 버세요. 네, 또 올게요.
So in this interaction, there's actually more switching than the last one. So what we find again is during the price negotiation, it's all pamal, it's all non-honorific language. But then when you get to the end of the clip, there's a switch. When they start to say goodbye to each other, when they go into the kind of insa in Korean, that's when they go back to honorific language. So we found that in quite a lot of the interactions. It opens in honorifics, it closes in honorifics, but the bargaining part in the middle takes place in non-honorific language. So the use of non-honorifics is kind of dividing these different parts of the interaction as well. So what this shows as well is that honorifics are not always necessarily something to do with politeness. In this final instance, the use of honorific and non-honorific language is also demarcating different types of activities and different types of speech. And indeed, using honorifics can also, in some situations, even be rude or sarcastic. So if you use honorifics in a situation where it's required according to socially normative conventions, so when you're addressing a superior, then it might seem respectful or polite, but honorifics also quite often appear in interactions between friends. And when this happens, they tend to take on different meanings.
야. 너 나 몰래 장가 들었냐?
뭔 소리야?
누가 너 어제 봤대더라. 애하고 와이프하고 같이 있는 것 같아서 아는 척 못했대.
아, 나 진짜 열받네. 아니, 누가 뭘 봤다 그래. 그냥 아는 사람들이야 조금.
요새 애가 아주 이상해요. 인순 씨부터 시작해서 수상한 게 한둘이 아니거든.
야, 넌 뭐가 그렇게 남의 사생활에 관심이 많냐? 대개일이나 신경 쓰셔.
예.
I don't know why I have French subtitles here. I have to try to get Russian next time. So basically this guy here is saying to the other guy who he works with and he was also good friends with, oh, I've heard that people keep on seeing you with this girl, and why aren't you telling me about this girl who you're with? So he keeps on asking him about that, and he doesn't particularly want to talk about it, basically. So he says, "Yolpanne," he's getting angry with all these questions. Then the friend says, "요새 애가 아주 이상해요." So we have the yo, the addressee honorific. So here this sounds a little bit sarcastic. It also sounds a bit distancing, like you're not telling me about this girl who everyone is seeing you with. I feel a little bit psychologically distant from you right now. And then at the end, he does get angry. And he says, why are you so interested in everyone's lives? Why don't you mind your own business? And in this sentence, mind your own business, we have tek, which is the kind of honorific second person pronoun, and 신경 쓰셔, which is a combination of referent honorifics, but then pamal as well. So this combination of referent honorifics, but no hero honorifics is very marked for sarcasm. But you can also sound sarcastic using honorifics, even if you are using honorifics alongside addressee honorifics, and even if you're using honorifics in a situation where you are expected to use them. So a good example of that I have here, this is a politician, Kim Tae-yong. You might remember, if you follow Korean affairs, that in 2000, there was this controversy that this Korean Korean warship was sunk, and some people claimed it was by North Korea. And there was an inquiry into this. And when Kim Tae-sung appeared at the inquiry, he was questioned about various things, and he was very angry and quite sarcastic in his answers. And he gained a lot of criticism at this time from the South Korean media as well. So, for example, in this quotation here, so when he was told that the chances of a North Korean submarine penetrating all of South Korea's defenses was 0.81%, he refers to this calculation as 나오지 않는 계산을 지금 만드신 박 의원이 대단히 훌륭하신 계산을 하셨는데. So he uses all of these honorifics to refer to this calculation that was made. And by doing this, it actually sounds fairly sarcastic, and that he's being dismissive of the calculation and the person who made it. So honorifics are not always polite, and also using honorifics on their own is not enough to guarantee politeness as well, even if you're doing that in a situation where they might be expected. So even if we can't hear whether people are using honorific language or not, we can usually tell just by the way that they are behaving, because when people are interacting with intimates, they behave in certain ways that, I'll just speed this up a little bit, but in certain ways that they would not do with status superiors. So you would not use these kind of very animated gestures when speaking with a status superior, for example. And we also see, if you're a fan of Korean television dramas, a lot of bodily contact, touching and so forth between intimate people as well. If you compare this with interactions between younger people with status superiors, you'll see quite different modes of bodily conduct taking place. So, of course, bowing, here letting the status superior sit down first. And let's see, forward it a little bit. Also a lot of different behaviors to do with eating and drinking as well. But I want to talk about two studies where we looked at this using laboratory data. And the first study I want to talk about here is a study where we looked at the acoustic properties of honorific and non-honorific speech in Korean and also in Japanese as well. So what we did in this study was we got Koreans and Japanese speakers into the laboratory. We provided them with several different pragmatic situations. So for example, you're in a car and the other person is driving and they take a wrong turn. And what do you say to the driver in this case? And then we ask them, what would you say if this person is your superior? And we show them a picture. And then what would you say if this person is your friend? And we show them a picture of their actual friend, which they supplied us with. And we get different productions based on this. I'll just play a couple. I hope you can hear these okay.
부장님, 제가 생각하기에 지금 이 길 지나친 것 같거든요. 저 여기 옆으로 빠졌어야 되는 건데 지금 돌아온 것 같아서요. 다시 한번 돌아서 가는 게 나을 것 같아요.
So that's the deferential one. So even if you're not a speaker of Korean, you can probably hear some kind of difference with the intimate one.
야, 여기 옆에 지났잖아. 아까 저기서 꺾었어야지. 야, 빨리 다시 돌아가.
Do you notice any difference in the sound? Shorter, right?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely shorter. Which one was higher pitched? Could anyone tell?
Yeah, the second.
Yeah, that's right, the second one. So the intimate one was higher pitched. Which one was louder?
Also the second.
Also the second. Okay, you're getting it right every time. Excellent. Yeah, so this is basically what we found. So we measured several different acoustic variables. I won't go into too much detail about what these things mean. You can ask me later if we have time, but basically they are measurements of these things, of pitch, loudness, instability, breathiness or hoarseness of the voice, and speed. Here, politeness main effect means, do the participants change their speech depending on whether they're talking to the older person or the younger person? And here, language interaction means, do Korean and Japanese behave differently? Yeah. So for pitch, we found that yes, lower pitch is more deferential, more polite, but we found that this was mostly in Korean. We didn't find such a difference in Japanese. Intensity, so this is loudness. We found that quieter speech is more polite, more deferential, as you heard yourself. Clearer speech is also more deferential, particularly in Korean. Breathier speech and less hoarse speech is more deferential, particularly in Korean. And finally, interestingly, we didn't actually find a difference in speech rate, but we did find a difference in duration. So speakers gave longer responses when they were talking to the status superior. One other difference we found was in hesitation markers in Korean. So hesitation markers mean things such as like when you say or ah or and so forth. So these kind of filler noises like ah and we found that speakers produced slightly more of these in the polite condition. So when they're doing deference, and also they produced more hiss-like noises. You might have noticed this yourself in Korean speech. It happens a little bit in English as well. I don't know about Russian, but sometimes speakers make a kind of hissing noise. It sounds like this, where you kind of suck in air, and when you breathe in air, you make it audible. We found that Korean speakers often use this as a kind of hesitation device. I'll play the example to show you what I mean.
물어보고 싶은 거 있어서 전화드렸는데요. 어떻게 교수님 밑에서 졸업 논문을 쓸 수 있는지, 아니면 논문 제출 기한을 언제까지 내는지, 혹시 면담 시간을 제가
Yeah, so quite often between sentences, sometimes after 제가, so sometimes with other kind of honorific markers as well. In another study that we're just finishing now, we also looked at gestures and how gestures change depending on whether speakers are talking to a status superior or to an intimate. This time we recorded not just the voice, but we recorded people's via video. And the task that we gave them was that they had to retell a cartoon. And this is a task that's been used in a lot of previous studies that look at gesture. So we analyzed, first of all, gesture frequency, and we found that speakers produced more gestures when talking with a friend and less gestures when talking with a professor. So this is just gestures with the hands and arms. We also measured gesture size, and we measured it on 3 different dimensions: vertical, transversal, so across, and also sagittal, which means like from front to back. And we found that on these different dimensions, speakers, on some of them at least, produced more frequent big gestures when interacting with the friend. So slightly more on the vertical plane, slightly more on the transversal plane. Sagittally large gestures were not very common anyway, but when they did occur, it tended to be with the friend. So we have less gestures and we have smaller gestures when talking with a superior. So here's an example that the video here is looping. So with the friend, we have this quite large gesture. With the professor, this smaller gesture. And here, what he is saying is actually exactly the same. And you see how with the professor, it's just on top of his knee. We also looked at these different aspects of motion events. When you are gesturing some kind of motion, there are 3 different things that you can include in your gesture. You can also include these things in your speech as well. One thing is path. Path refers to the direction of the movement. So in this case, if you're describing the cat going up the drain pipe, if you just did this, you would be gesturing path. Manner means how the thing is moving. So is it sliding? Is it bouncing? Is it rolling? These are manner gestures. So if you're saying that the cat climbed up the drain pipe, you could do something like that with manner. So this is manner and path. Ground then refers to the object which the figure is moving in relationship with. So here it might be the pipe. So the cat went up the pipe. So my hand here is the ground. So what we did was we looked at how frequently our participants encoded these different things in their gestures. We found that if you just look at the percentages here, basically for path, there was no difference. So it seems that for path, this is the most basic part of a motion gesture, and speakers tend to encode it at the same frequency. However, we did find some qualitative differences in how they encoded it. So we found that sometimes with the professor, the way they encoded it was different to the direction of the actual motion. So here the ball is going down the drain pipe. With the friend, it goes down, but with the professor, his actual gesture just goes across. Do you see that? So it's actually, it's incorrect in what it's representing. Then for manner, we did find a decrease, which was statistically significant. So when speaking with a superior, they included manner less frequently, and they also included ground less frequently as well. So this is an example of ground. So with the friend, you have the drain pipe going up the drain pipe. So the drain pipe's here, but with the professor, where's the drain pipe gone? There's no drain pipe there, but he does give this kind of closed hand position, which gives the feeling that it's inside of something. So he manages to give that meaning on some level. We also looked at viewpoint in gesture. Studies on gesture differentiate between 2 viewpoints. One is called character viewpoint and one is called observer viewpoint. Character viewpoint is when your body becomes the body of the character that you're talking about. So if you're talking about a cat climbing up a pipe, if I want to do a character viewpoint gesture, I do something like this, right? So my body is the cat's body, my arms are the cat's arms. Observer is when you look at it from an external position and your hand becomes the character. So my hand is the cat. So an observer gesture would look something like this, right? And what we found was that basically these character viewpoint gestures are less frequent with the professor. So speakers don't like to do as many of these character viewpoint gestures, which tend to be very animated when they're talking with a status superior. So to show you one example, at the end of this cartoon clip, Sylvester swallows this bowling ball and it goes into his stomach. So you see here with the friend, her own stomach has the bowling ball inside it, but with the professor, the bowling ball is inside her hands. So with the friend, this is character viewpoint. With the professor, this is observer viewpoint. So, you know, these character viewpoint gestures are very animated. Also doing things with your own kind of body and pretending that things are inside your stomach. These are going to be things which are more sensitive not to do with a status superior. I'll just briefly mention finally another part of this study that we're doing. We're looking at specifically interpersonal synchrony. Now, what interpersonal synchrony means, apologies for the terrible picture, it means the extent to which interacting individuals become similar over time, right? So Trump smiles and Kim smiles back, right? When we're interacting with people, we tend to copy the way they talk. We also copy the way that they gesture, and we align our gestures with the other person. And previous studies have showed that this kind of synchrony in gesture and body movement is sensitive to the social situation. So when people are arguing, they don't synchronize their body movements as much, for instance. That makes sense, right? So we shot our videos from the side in order to allow for this kind of analysis. So basically what this analysis does is that we break down the two halves of the image and then compare the pixel movements on both sides. And this allows us to see whether the movements mirror each other and also whether the movements are locked in time as well. And what we found was quite nice. We found that basically this shows that for the friend situation, speakers do synchronize their movements and that this is time locked, but with the professor, this does not take place. So this seems to make sense, that you can, it's perfectly acceptable and indeed expected that when you're talking with an intimate person, you mirror each other's body language, but when you're talking with a social superior, that's going to become less appropriate. So to summarize what I've been talking about today, so we said that Korean has a highly developed system of honorifics. We also said that honorifics are used in a dynamic and varied way. So there's a lot of variation in how they're used. Honorifics do not equal politeness. It depends on the context, and it also depends on what occurs alongside honorifics as well. So honorifics are not working on their own. Everything is working together as a package. And these different cues come together to guarantee that politeness-related meanings are communicated in a very robust way. A further point to consider, which I have looked at in my previous research, is how do second language learners learn politeness? How do learners of Korean learn honorifics? That's maybe something we can talk about in the discussion if we have time. So that's me. I'll say spasiba, 고맙습니다. I can't be with you in Moscow now, but there's a picture of me in Moscow last time I was there. And also today is, of course, Lunar New Year's Day in Korea. So 새해 복 많이 받으세요. Thank you.
네, 새해 복 많이 받으세요, 교수님. Thank you very much for sharing with us your ideas, and I'm sure that many of us will benefit of these ideas. So now we have questions and answers time. I hope that those who have questions will type them in the Zoom chat box, or you can raise your hand and ask questions. And I see the first question from Alexei Nosov. It's our student, third grade student. Alexei, I think you
Yes,
can...
thank you, Professor Brown. It was very interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about the change of the honorifics in the past, and maybe how do you see them in the future? Because the Korean society changes. It's changing a lot in the past few years. And what do you think about it? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the very interesting question. Yeah, I mean, honorifics have changed throughout time. Korean has had honorifics for a very, very long time. During the kind of Choson period, this was when a lot of honorifics became more stabilized, and when their usage started to be attached to kind of Confucian hierarchical social values. So that's a kind of the very kind of big picture. I guess in more recent years, some things that have happened is that the use of honorifics for marking relative status in a very absolute way has started to weaken somewhat. So a couple of things, going back a bit further, we're talking like maybe 30, 40 years ago, maybe you would use non-honorifics to a taxi driver or someone who does some work for you, but that these days in Korea, that would be very inappropriate to do that. Then what you're seeing as well is a lot of the replacement of hierarchical honorifics use with reciprocal honorifics usage. So for example, in relationships between university professors and their students, the norm in the past was for professors to use 반말, non-honorific language to students, but increasingly it's going towards professors and students both using honorifics to each other, or at least "요" on the part of the professor. And this also happens within kind of 선배, 후배 relationships in universities as well. So there's this kind of flattening of honorifics usage there. I also mentioned, this usage of 시 in the service industry more as a kind of general politeness marker rather than a referent honorific marker as such. So I think in some ways things are getting kind of flattened out, but at the same time, this does actually not necessarily make things simpler. It makes things maybe more complicated and more difficult for speakers to negotiate and navigate what the actual norm should be.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Brown. And maybe we have another questions. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting, and it is a new point of view on honorifics and politeness in Russian. It was amazing, really, for us. And I have one question. What do you think the politeness or honorifics forms are defined by the rule of high context culture? I mean that we, in our research, now can say that the honorific languages or honorific forms are the languages of the high context culture, and non-honorific forms is languages of low context culture. What do you think about these honorific forms in the context of high and low context culture?
So I guess one thing that we know about high context cultures is that in high context cultures, human relationships tend to be very important, and altering your social behavior depending on the situation and being sensitive to the context is thought to be very, very important as well. So I think in a sense we can see this kind of relationship. I wonder, however, whether sometimes things can kind of work the other way as well, that the presence of honorifics in Japanese and Korean and its visibility, and because we point to it as being this marker of politeness, it makes us very aware that in these languages, these aspects of sociality are encoded. But maybe other languages do this, but not in ways that are as obvious to us. That is something I would say about this as well. In another project I've been working on recently, we've been kind of interviewing Korean people in Seoul about what politeness means to them, right? And we actually start by asking them, what is important to you in interaction, right? And when we were making up this question, we tended to think, I think maybe we coming from, the Australian mindset in this case, that people might say things like, oh, what's important in communication is making sure you're understood, or what's important in communication is getting your message across, because these tend to be the ideologies of communication in many societies in Europe and beyond. But when we ask these questions to Korean participants, that's not what they said, never. They always said, what's important is the relationship, right? What's important is, not hurting the other person. Yeah, so a very different ideology of communication.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Brown. Yeah, and we have one question more from Maria Cherniak, a student of High School of Economics. Please, Maria.
Yeah, thank you for the lecture. My question is similar to the first one. So we can say that there is a tendency not to follow strictly the rules of using honorifics. Am I right?
Tendency not to follow strictly the rules of using honorifics. Well, I think this kind of depends on the context. Definitely we should not say that there are no rules of using honorifics. And definitely in some situations, speakers will feel a lot of social pressure, or or just will feel that it's the normal thing to do to use honorifics. So if you are, if you address your university professor or your teacher in 반말, or you use 반말 to your boss, then you can get expelled from school or you can get fired. So in some situations, the rules about using honorifics are very, very strict. But that tells half the story, I think. Then we get into the question of what, how about if you're in a position of power? Or how about if you're in a position of equal power with the other speaker? I think in these contexts, that's where it gets a lot more fluid. So, some of the examples I showed you were from the market, or from, service encounters. In service encounters, okay, we might think that people providing services have to be polite to their customers, but this is not a context which has the same kind of social sanctions as using honorifics towards your boss or using honorifics towards your teacher. So I think it does depend on the context, how strict the rules can be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I have two questions, Dr. Brown. The first one is about experiment you showed us, you did for your research. So when filming those people, did you consider in any way the fact that those people were aware of being filmed while talking to partner? Yeah. That's the first question. Yeah. Maybe it's somehow influenced their speech and gestures and so on.
Yeah, so we call this kind of the observation paradox, that if we observe people and put a video camera in front of them, that this will influence their performance, but we can't analyze their performance without putting a video camera in front of them. I think what generally is said about this is that, yes, this does influence people's performance, definitely at the start of interactions, but as things go on, people do become more relaxed. And also that people do not invent their social behavior just because a camera is there. They might alter their social behavior, but they don't just invent it from the void. Some kind of other things that we did in that situation I mean, one other actual concern we had in doing these recordings was that the order of recordings can also influence these kind of factors. So we had our speakers do the same task twice, once with a friend and once with a professor. Other studies also show that when speakers do the same activity twice, the second time they do it, they tend to gesture less, speak quicker, and so forth. So it influences these same kind of things. So we had to do it that half the speakers did the friend interaction first and half the speakers did the professor interaction first. And we also had to do it so that it was on different days. So there was always a time difference between the recordings.
Okay, I see. And thank you. Yeah, and the other question is concerning your last remark about further discussion. Topic for further discussion is about teaching honorifics. So as being a Korean language teacher, I wonder, could you share, maybe do you have any ideas about teaching those multimodal aspects of honorifics, I mean politeness, polite speech in Korean during Korean class?
I think these things are very teachable and can be fun to teach, and also are very accessible. One reason for that is a lot of these things are actually fairly universal, that speakers of all languages do these differences in their behaviors. It's probably just that in Korea, Korean speakers are doing them more. So I do think that from when you're using honorifics, it's not enough just to put your on the end of the sentence or 습니다 on the end of the sentence, that it's actually the whole kind of comportment as well. Again, I don't think this is something that you can necessarily kind of force your students to do, but I think it's something that your students can build awareness of. So these days, there's a lot of, obviously our access to Korean television and so forth, I think is a wealth of information on these things. That's where I would start, just trying to make people aware of them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. And okay, so we have a question from Ariana Skari. It's our colleague from Minsk, Belarus. Ariane, yeah.
Hello, Professor Brown. Thank you very much for very interesting lecture. And my question is as following. There are some cases when respect to a young person is shown without using honorifics. For example, in case of 하계체, such pronoun as 자네 can be used to show respect. For example, 자네가 참 기특하네. So while conducting your research, I mean in real conversations, so in marketplaces and so on, have you ever met such cases in real conversation when without using honorifics, people showed some respect to a younger person?
It's an interesting, very interesting question, actually, because I think that there's two parts to it. I mean, firstly, what do we mean by respect? And in the Korean context, we tend to think of respect as being this kind of hierarchical thing, that you are paying respect to elders. But is that the meaning of respect, even in the Korean context? I think not necessarily. So, the Korean word for respect, or one word, is 존중. I mentioned before that we did this project where we interviewed Korean people about politeness, and actually one term we asked them about was 존중, and we asked them, what does that mean? And some people said that, 존중, being respectful, is something that you do to superiors, but actually more people said that it's more about 인격체. It's more about being respectful to people as fellow human beings. So I think if we're to talk about respect in the Korean context, we should not limit our definition of respect just to respect for status superiors. And definitely there's another part of respect, which is respect for people who are younger than you as well. Now, as for 하계체, yes, so this is definitely interesting in the fact that 하계체 we think of as quite an antiquated speech style that is, used in just some very specific occurrences. And I think this shows us that this respect for younger people is not something that's new in Korean culture. It's something that has existed for quite a while. So I think that's a really interesting point. As for do I find that much in my data? Unfortunately, no. Unfortunately, that's not something I've looked at particularly, and not something I don't think I have any occurrences of it naturally occurring in my data. That's something that I think should be looked at more, but I think it's very difficult to get the data because just the usage, the frequency is so low.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and I saw the question from my colleague, Elena Khokhlova. Yeah.
I will give the way to our students first, if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah. And question from Elizaveta Krivonosova. Elizaveta is our student. Okay, Elizaveta.
Thank you for so interesting lecture. I would like to know, should foreigners use more honorifics than Koreans? For example, can foreigners speak with vendors on Panmal, and how Koreans feel about it when listening from foreigners?
Good question. Yeah.
Excellent question. Excellent question. I don't know if this question has a right or a wrong answer. I think in some respects, if when you are a non-native speaker, you have more freedom to use language how you want, because sometimes your misuse of language might be ignored due to your as kind of a linguistic proficiency issue. So people might let you off that. But on the other hand, this kind of use of PAMAL, PAMAL is this register of language which is used within intimate groups. And I think it also works that when we're learning a second language, when we start to use language that is more informal and more intimate, it becomes more difficult. And quite often it seems strange for us if we hear someone speaking our language and using informal words. So if I hear someone who is a non-native speaker of English using a lot of swear words or something, this can sound more strange than hearing a native speaker use them. I think this is something that's fairly universal. So I think if a Korean language learner went into the market and started using PAMAL, I think people would pick up on it more. I think they might be more sensitive to it. Probably the advice I would give you is, if you go to the market, definitely use 존댓말 at the start. But if they start using PAMAL to you, then I would start using PAMAL back. I think you have to keep yourself in the interaction as well. To be honest, I don't have that many experiences. I'm not someone who does a lot of shopping when I go to Seoul. Sometimes the people who use PAMAL to me, sometimes I find like a taxi drivers, and if they start using PAMAL to me, I'll use PAMAL back. But that's me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a question in the chat from Inna Tsoi. I can read question, or Inna, you can speak loud and switch on your microphone. Okay, the question is, what do you think about the situation when parents use honorifics when talking to their kids? And do you have some research about it?
Yeah, another great question. So this is something that has been talked about in quite a lot of previous research, and it does happen a lot. I think a couple of things are going on with this. On one level, it is parents teaching honorifics to their children. So they are socializing their children into the use of honorifics, and they're using their own speech as a model. That is something that is happening there. Again, this is something that's fairly universal. Parents in English-speaking cultures use lots of please and thank you to their kids to kind of model that. So parents are just doing pretty much the same thing. Some of the research on this for Japanese, I don't think there's as much for Korean, but has shown that parents tend to use honorifics in particular kinds of utterances, or when they're doing particular things. So particularly when they are speaking in their roles as parents, right? So if they're just chatting to the kids about something, they don't use honorifics. But if they are like saying to the kids, oh, can I get you some more food? This is when they start using honorifics. So when they're doing things related to parenting, such as offering food, telling kids to brush their teeth and things like that. These are when the honorific utterances start to appear.
Okay, thank you. And and we have question from Dana Ospano. Dana, please switch on your microphone and camera.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I have a question about expressing sarcasm in Korean. So you said that Koreans may use honorifics in order to be more sarcastic, and I wanted to ask if this way of using honorifics is socially accepted. And I mean, is it rather rude to use honorifics in such way, or maybe it just shows only distancing and disagreeing with the person we're talking to?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I'll take the part about is it rude first, and then maybe we can talk about is it socially accepted. it's maybe not necessarily exactly the same thing. What I've found in my study on this, and what I've seen more generally, is that in most cases, it's not used for genuine rudeness. So when we're talking about rudeness and impoliteness, there is kind of genuine impoliteness. So when we use impolite language in order to hurt someone, or in order to show someone that we're angry or something like that. But there's also using impoliteness as some kind of in-group identity marker. So when we're with friends, we might use more swear words, and we might call our friends bad things, but they will accept that that's just some kind of marker of intimacy, right? So rude language can be a marker of intimacy as well. So, you know, if you're using sarcastic honorifics in an intimate relationship, in a non-conflict situation, then it's not necessarily rude, right? Now, the example I showed you was between friends, but they were in conflict, right? So in that situation, it's a little bit different. I think they are actually trying to be rude to each other, but I think that's maybe more of the exception rather than the norm. Is it socially acceptable? Well, it happens a lot. It's definitely very common. Is it socially acceptable? Well, to an extent, it's not, to the extent that the use of honorifics is still seen at a societal level as being something that should be used in a correct way. So it's not prescriptively correct language. That's something that you could say about social acceptability. Again, you know, with impolite language, we just have to be careful of the context that we use it. If we use it in a context where we're just having a joke with friends, it's going to be okay. But if you use this kind of language towards non-intimates in a situation of conflict, then it really can be quite a bad thing to do.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And thank you, Dana, for this question. Okay, so now, Elena, who I can ask a question. Yeah, please, Elena.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. It was very interesting, and I'm happy that you've said some things that we've been telling our students during the classes, so maybe they will listen to us more carefully.
Oh, good.
And I have a very simple question. Like, I think like in any other countries, the more well-educated, the more well-mannered people are, the more politely they speak. So it doesn't matter like whether it's in Russia, whether it's in Korea. So do you think like, because in Korea, sometimes I've seen people talking like the same level, like professor and student. Some professor would speak in Panmal, some professor would speak in Chondemal. So do you think it really depends on how well-mannered, how well-educated people are?
It's a good question. And I think it actually sometimes the simple questions are the good ones. And this one I think allows me to talk about something that I didn't really pick up on in my talk. You know, when we're talking about politeness, we quite often think about politeness as something which I do for someone else, right? And that has been referred to in the literature. You know, this is going back to Irving Goffman. This is deference. But there's also another part of politeness, which is referred to as demeanor, which is the part of politeness where I'm performing something as part of my identity, right? And if I use polite language according to social convention, how do I appear? Definitely I can appear more educated, right? Because politeness, using correct politeness forms, these are often things which you gain access to through education. You know, using honorifics correctly is going to be easier for you if you've gone through a university education, because it's at university where you get to use simnidache for the first time mostly, and where you get to learn about some of the more complex usages of honorifics. So it becomes a marker of your identity. And for people who don't know how to use honorifics as well, it becomes difficult for them to enter certain social situations because they don't have the access to this use of language as well. So definitely it can be a marker of identity. If you use more polite language, you sound more educated. But do people always like people who are more polite? Sometimes, yeah, but it depends, right? But also we can have negative impressions of people who are very polite. We can think that they're kind of false, or that they're kind of, you know, sucking up, or kind of ass kissing like people are above them. And, so, you know, you can have that kind of impression as well. So yeah, excellent question. And definitely there's the two sides to it.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And we have one more question from Daria Stofarova. Daria, please.
Thank you for your lecture. It was very useful, especially for me as I'm a first-year student. As I understand, honorifics can be an instrument of expressing an opinion about something or someone. And I have a question. Do Koreans use it as insult, or can they use it especially to show disrespect maybe to someone?
Sorry, I couldn't hear the question. I think there was a problem with the sound.
Yeah, maybe with connection. Daria, you can
put it in the chat.
Write down your question in the chat.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question. Koreans use it as insult, like honorifics. Can they use it especially to show disrespect to someone, maybe?
To respect someone, did you say?
Disrespect.
To disrespect?
Yes.
Well, yes, I guess this can go both ways. So definitely dropping honorifics in a situation where you're expected to use them can sound disrespectful. But also maybe using too many honorifics and using too high honorifics can also sound sarcastic and therefore disrespectful as well. I hope that answers the question. It's still a bit difficult to hear.
Yeah.
There's something on the chat.
So yeah, there's one more question in the chat. Yeah, from Varvara Pakhomova. Yeah, what do you think about the ways Koreans start using panmal when speaking to foreigners, especially when the age is nearly the same young people? And what is your impression how it corresponds with personal character traits? Is there any pattern of behavior? Yeah, that's a question.
Yeah, I did actually do a research project on this some years back, looking at how second language learners learn honorifics, but also their usage and maybe what kind of language they receive from Korean people as well. And it's really mixed. It's really quite a mixed bag. So I think some, you know, I'm generalizing here, but some Korean people I think will be more careful to use honorific language when they're speaking with non-Korean students. So one example from my own data was that, you know, a professor in a class spoke panmal to every Korean student, and then the one non-Korean student in the class was addressed in 존댓말 always. So, you know, that's one example. But then some of the other participants in my study said to me that they had situations where Korean people addressed them in panmal, where they thought that that would not happen in Korean interactions. That's difficult to say, though, because that was just their perception that they would not be addressed in panmal if they were Korean. You know, who really knows? But I think that situation can occur too. So I think the point here is that this way of using honorifics according to social status, this is a culture-specific mode of interaction. And there is the perception in Korea that this is something that is specific to Korean culture or maybe Asian culture, and it's not something that they expect people from outside of Korea or outside of Asia to fit into. So when you have Korean-speaking non-Koreans, the question of how they fit into that structure, if they do, is something that works differently for different Korean speakers.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, do we have any other questions? I can't see frozen hands. So I think, no, yeah, one more question from our colleague, Arina Shinova. So yeah, in Korean, we have many ways to say you, like 전에, 그대, 당신, no, but mostly we don't use them and use words like 사장님, 선생님, 어머니 to say you. Do you think it's also the way to show respect? Does it go with the term of honorifics or not?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is definitely part of the same phenomenon. So I didn't have time to talk about this in my presentation, but if we're talking about honorifics in Korean, I think we need to talk about address terms and pronouns as well. And the one really interesting thing, and this question picks up on it, is that in Korean, pronouns tend to be non-honorific. So there's no real pronoun you could use if you're addressing a status superior. So therefore, you have to use a term of address. And then the other thing which you have going on in Korean is the avoidance of personal names as well. So if you're addressing someone who is older than you, even if it's just like 1 year, you generally won't use their name. You'll use a title or a kinship term. So this very different orientation to European languages, where instead of using names and pronouns, you use titles and kinship terms instead. So yeah, definitely this is to do with the same phenomenon.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and I think we have time for the last question, and that will be from my colleague, Elena Hochlova again. Yeah, please, Elena.
Thank you once again. I have very simple, short question. How long have you been studying the politeness in Korean language? I think we are all curious. How long?
How long?
How long have you been doing this research here?
Let me think. Since my PhD, so starting in like 2003 to 2004. So yeah, more than 15, but not yet 20 years.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, quite a lot.
Thank
yeah, we could see it during the lecture. Okay, so yeah, I think it's time to finish. Yeah, thank you, Professor Brown. Thank you very much for this brilliant lecture. Thank you for coming today. Yeah, thank you for accepting our invitation. I hope that that's not the last our meeting. Yeah. Maybe, yeah, I hope you will come and we'll give another talk about your research. I see that our students and my colleagues are very interested in this topic, and yeah, I hope there will be it will be continued. Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming today. Yeah, I think we all benefited from your ideas and insights from your lecture and during the question session. Yeah, it took more than 30 minutes, just almost like a lecture. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And it was great, amazing, and new, fresh for us. Yeah, thank you very much. And we hope that you come to impressive, and we hope that you come again to our discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it was great to get so many excellent questions. I really enjoyed receiving all your questions and giving me kind of a new way of thinking about some of these problems. So thank you. And thank you for inviting me.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So that was a win-win. Okay, yeah, thank you, everyone. And so have a good day. Yeah, and have a good evening, Dr. Brown. So because it's evening in Australia. Yeah. So and have a great weekend. So thank you again, and see you next time.
Thank you. It was a great present for Happy New Lunar Year. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah. See you again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Goodbye.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.